Good afternoon and most welcome to H799. I mentioned before I get more and more nervous approaching the famous 800, and I was wondering if that should not be done in the locale of RBF. See if that would be possible with some fitting celebrations to go with it, including something bubbly of some sort. Maybe I had to be without alcohol because I had to drive, but I don't know. Let's see what happens. It will not be that specific. It will be an introduction for us all, including me, about topology. And this is because we are going to have a Zoom meeting with a professor of topology, and I think we need some background. I was yesterday given a 3-semester book in topology. I don't think I can delve into that directly. So this is a pretty good start. This is for layman, and since topology is something that includes every subject, we constantly use topology. This is incredibly important as well for even us laymen. One of the fellows that has been incorporating topology to a great degree into his thinking is Heidegger, and one of his followers put it very aptly, and that is Merleau-Ponty, and he is mirrored here in the text by Merleau. And whereas you can say that Merleau-Ponty is the white side of the difference, the black side is the Merleau. And you are a little bit skillful in French, you know what Merleau means. It also means black, that taken from the blackbird, and it's also taken for, in context, in reference to the blackbird, the blackest of the blackest grapes, the Merlot grape, one of the most popular grapes to make different French wines. Well, wines all over the place. And this is a sort of topological space. To understand the relationship between these different things, we need to understand the topological consequences. As I mentioned earlier, it's our understanding of the topology that makes a very tough break between subject and object. It is almost like that lack of understanding says, in between subject and object and in thinking, there is no space, there's no topology. Space is different. Space is, after that amnesia, thought to be something outside of the mind and different from the mind. Remember the distinction I made between subject and object. In between subject and object there is a distance, but this distance is not perceived ordinarily by philosophers and thinking to be a real distance. And it is instead a know-nothing, or a no-known, I would call it. It's a sort of no-known. Also similar in structure, no. So if you ask somebody about the subject and object, they're just going to give a blank. And I remember that because we took it up when we studied logic. Logic is very clearly topological. You cannot understand ordinals or cardinals and hierarchy without having a keen understanding of space. But whereas we passed from logic to philosophy, we still have that thought in the head. What is to do with space? Space is obviously part of the deepest roots in thinking. But for some reason, when we asked the teacher and we start to think about it, he said, there's no space there. And what is thinking there? Nobody knows, he said. And that was a little bit like going into a wall. There was no more talking, and there was no more thinking. And maybe even more important, we didn't look into the subject deeper. And later, when I started with Derrida, I started to understand everything is connected to space. In original, space is there. This is the Western non-recognition or denial of space is part of the problem. Why is there a denial of space? Well, the reason obviously being that we never look into the relationship between subject and object. The sharp dividing line, as I said before, is made by happenstance. It's a chance thing. It was never thought of. Nobody had said or thought or pointed or done anything for this to happen. It's pure chance. It has similarities with what a mirror is, but why a mirror was picked and nothing else, and why this particular aspect of the mirror, because a mirror can be perceived in other ways. Other cultures do not perceive mirrors in this way. That was a complete happenstance. So part of the amnesia that Heidegger talked about is, according to Merleau-Ponty, this denial of spaciousness, this denial of knowing the terrain of thinking or controlling the thinking. And I remember Bertrand Russell here indicated in one of his writings that thinking, nobody will ever know what it is and it cannot be controlled. And that's sort of scary to say that. It means that we are completely deterministic. And this was in a period when Bertrand Russell was a solipsist. And the reason he was a solipsist was that he thought that he'd had no control over his own life and neither of his own thinking. And therefore, with no will, you are a solipsist because there is nothing to react about in the rest of the world. The only thing you do in that case is to reflect. I would say this was a little bit precognitive of another person that came much later. Precognitive. And what he's anticipating here is the American philosopher of mind, Daniel Dennett, who said exactly the same thing but in other terms. This is a denial of every trait of consciousness. And this is what is at the bottom of the original error or happenstance or chance. And that is that consciousness does not have any place in reality. And after that started a more or less unconscious battle against consciousness, that we could be conscious. And one of those aspects that are very interesting, it sounds like this in the book. Descartes' assumption, this is from Merleau-Ponty, is that space simply is there. That is subsist of a positive presence possessing no folds or nuances, no shadows, shadings, or subtle gradations. Space is thus taken as an utterly explicit openness that constitutes a field of strictly external relations wherein ambiguous measurement can be made. So in this vision, mind has become purely a reflective thing, and something that just reflects is not conscious at all. It's just a mirror. Reflective thought is still within us. This is what Daniel Dennett means. He says, in effect, that our mind solely represents what's around it, nothing else. There is no will and there is no consciousness. There's nothing that decides anything. There is no active agent. And I would say, agreeing with Merleau-Ponty, as soon as you rid space out of the picture, which was done before space was even thought of, you end up in a battle against consciousness itself. You want to make everything passive by this forgetfulness, this amnesia. And it's so interesting when we start to realizing that thinking is something that takes place in space, and that space is movable. You can do things with it. The first strike we had about this was Barbara Tversky, that showed that we can change thinking. We can think differently. We just don't digest reality like a cow eating its hay, and unconsciously it gets metabolists into some sort of project. You can see this description anticipates or is precognitive of the mechanical model we later got, where we are nothing but robots and our only duty or thing to do in the world is just to observe, do nothing else. And of course that rids us of any inkling of free will, but also of consciousness. So the mirror effect, according to Merleau-Ponty, is simply that we are completely unconscious. We are in a coma, so to speak. We move about, yes, and things can happen, but nothing is regulated by mind. Mind is mindless in this context. And remember the dividing line that René Descartes made. The dividing line for him was between the soul and the body, what he called the soul at that time. And the soul was automatic. Thoughts came coming. He never defined thoughts. He never thought about thoughts, what they could be. That could be part of space. They were a big know-nothing. Whereas the body, it moved about by itself. It had no connection to the soul or the thoughts. It just moved. They were inhabiting two different realms. And of course, this rids the soul of every action, of every intention, because he delegated the body and the intentions to another world. And he even said that there were no connection in between the two things. There was some exception for a short while when he said that the pine gland was the connection, but not an effective connection. It was just a possible connection. But usually he had this division. This, I would say, it's a picture that comes from a mentally ill person, a person who doesn't have any control of his body and soul. And it goes for a condition called psychoactive condition. And it means a person who doesn't feel his body or her body at all, and moves about in a manner that's quite mechanical. And when such a person is asked, do you have control of your thinking and movement? That person will say, I don't even know what that is. Has no understanding of it. And it's not a question only not to know it explicitly and know it implicitly, by hand or by doing. That person literally don't know how to move about, will move in a manner that is scary to look at even. It looks like a gold or something horrible. It's really horrible. Especially when there are deep down in this state. Merleau-Ponty also goes into space as we know it from topology and also from quantum mechanics. Says like this is by Rosen himself. Merleau-Ponty contrasts the Cartesian view of depth with the true depth found in the life world, where we discover in dialectal action or perceptual experience a paradoxical interplay of the visible and invisible, of identity and difference. There you have body and soul. Well, for that matter, also meaning and word. This is a cite from Merleau-Ponty. The enigma consists in the fact that I see things, each one in its place, precisely because they eclipse one another, and that they are rivals before my sight, precisely because each one is in its own place. Their exteriority is known in their envelopment and the mutual dependence in their autonomy. There is a dependence also. Once depth is understood in this way, we can no longer call it a third dimension. In the first place, if it were a dimension, it would be the first one. There are forms and definite planes only if it is stipulated how far from me the different parts are. But a first dimension that contains all the others is no longer a dimension, at least in the ordinary sense of a certain relationship, according to which we make measurements. Depth, thus understood, is rather the experience of the reversibility of dimension, of a global locality. Everything in the same place at the same time, a locality from which height, width and depth are abstracted. So the ordinary, so to speak, Cartesian height, width, depth are abstracted from a true dimension, a true space. And of course, topology is not Cartesian anymore. It hasn't been for 100 years, not since non-Euclidean space. And once you got to know non-Euclidean space, you start to understand that the difference between big and small is not an abstraction. It's rather something directly experienced. And that is very different because this model is very much connected to the idea of we being unconscious. And we turn ourselves into the origo here, an unconscious seer, like a camera or something, that just sees the object but doesn't interact with it, doesn't think anything about it. And how is such a subject supposed to experience everything? I don't know. But Descartes never thought about this thing. That's why nobody knows what this is. And when realizing this, I understand more and more. By understanding topology, you are going to sort of discover new things in your own environment. That could even be in this room number 9. And all of a sudden, it might not look as dull as it usually does. Once you desert this idea, because this idea is an abstraction from something that is much more encompassing and where things are actually having true depth, width and height. So this is just a little start. Sorry it was so short, this
20 minutes.
ultimate. We had the penultimate before, and this is the ultimate before the big 800. Isn't that rather exciting? I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.